Hello, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon if you're streaming and watching online. Super excited to have this conversation today. And we have the perfect person to do it with us. Please welcome Anurag Sahay, Chief Technology Officer of Data and AI at Nagarro.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thanks so much for being with us. Anurag, this is a great way to kick off day two. As Rochelle alluded to, I think AI came up in almost every panel and every conversation, certainly off stage as well. But it looks different for every company. And it seems like we're at a tipping point. So I think that it would be great for you to just start with talking about how should we be thinking about AI when it comes to energy transition? And I have in mind that it's part of the demand issue, but potentially part of the solution issue too, which makes it complicated. But how should we be thinking about it?
Well, thank you so much for the question. It's a great way to open up. And personally, I just love talking about AI in all its different guises and forms. But I'd like to relate it, relate all of this to personal experiences that we are continuously having as individuals, as business leaders, as executives and so forth, right? I mean, if you remember COVID, right? I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, wasn't that long. But since then, everybody I speak to, they come back and say, hey, listen, the world has changed. It's no longer the world that we lived in pre-COVID. And that's a very remarkable experience that people are, practically everybody, I'm assuming all of the people in the room probably at some level are feeling that, right? What has changed in this process? And there are various theories, there are various hypotheses that people profess. One important thing that is very common across all of that is that volatility and uncertainty has increased. These are two really key things that probably people sense. They are not articulating it well enough, but just that it exists at some level. The world's not as definite as it was pre-COVID. And there are various reasons for it. One could go into geopolitical issues, one could get into economic policy, one could get into energy crisis and how we are really thinking about the world. One could even think about tech at some level. But this world is getting increasingly complex. And what we need at some level is mechanisms and tools to be able to deal with this world. And interestingly, this is where I think AI really positions itself most appropriately. It is the tool to help us deal with this world, which is increasingly becoming nonlinear, increasingly chaotic and complex. It's something that we call as complex adaptive system, right? Like these are complex networks. There is a small perturbation somewhere, and it has oversized outcomes or consequences elsewhere. So AI, in my formulation of how I think about it, is the solution to this very complex world that is beginning to emerge today.
That's so interesting that you tied it back to a much broader scope. And I think that that's a really interesting definition, because I think people are applying it to their sort of siloed situation or need. But if you think about it at that level, so how should we think about this journey and it changing? Because right now, I heard a really fascinating thing that depending on what age you are, depends on how you use AI, right? So, young people use it, we use it as a substitute for search. Maybe we're deploying it within our companies. Sam Altman was talking about this. Young people use it as their operating system. Right. But how should, in a business context, how is it developing, and what's the difference between what we may be touching now as AI and where you think it's going?
Excellent. And that framing is very, very crucial, because yesterday I was at the speaker's dinner, and this conversation came up, which was just an excellent question, was like, is there an energy transition? And the word transition was really focused on. And I was like, from my perspective, and I'm talking about AI, there's definitely a transition. And I kind of call it AI 1.0 and AI 2.0. And that's the transition, just a placeholder, a paradigm to sort of separate these two different worlds that we lived in. See, in the ways when businesses used to think about AI back in 2019, 2018, one of the key topics that people were dealing with was predictive AI. It was all about prediction. It was about classification. It was about taking some information, tagging it in a certain manner, and then using it in a very powerful way to make decisions. So predictive AI was the key idea, right? The second thing that people used to do pre-COVID was that they'd look at a whole workflow, and then they'd find let me apply AI here at this point. Let's say I want to do forecasting here. And let's just take that, build a really nice forecasting model and use that output very powerfully to get an outcome. So it was point-based, look at a whole workflow and find interesting points and then apply AI there. And the third thing was that it was practically all about building on the cloud, building on these platforms like hyperscalers and so forth. These were the characteristics of AI and the way business leaders used to think about. And of course, data was always and has been the challenge, right? So that was a common theme across. But come to 2025, post-COVID, ChatGPT, and all of it, right? All of that has dramatically changed. Today, for example, it's not about predictive AI. It's about, do you have AI that can actually sense the world? It can make sense of the world. It understands language. It understands objects in this world. It can respond to that kind of knowledge, which humanity has built over years in the form of books and content and so forth, right? It understands that. It can reason with it, which is another step, right? Like it takes a hypothesis, it goes through that thinking process step by step and reaches completely different conclusions, or in some cases, very, very interesting insights, right? So it's got reasoning built in. And so thinking and reasoning, understanding, thinking and reasoning are like the key characteristics of this new AI, right? And that's where like ChatGPT comes in, really, like as an example, which I'm assuming everybody uses it, but there are just so many of them. There are vision models, there are audio models, and they're understanding content. They're not struggling with words. It's not like, well, at some level people say, hey, it's all pattern recognition. But regardless, if I give it a poem, and I say, hey, criticize or critique this poem, it'll come out with a very interesting critique, which means that it understands that really, right? So one of the important characteristics of post-COVID AI is that it's all about thinking, perceiving, understanding, however you want to call it, thinking and reasoning. The second important thing about this new AI is that it's no longer about point intervention. It's like taking a whole workflow and just making it AI-enabled. So it's not like, oh, let me try and figure out like, oh, I can get a forecasting here, I can get a prediction here, and then I'll do some stitching and orchestrating. No. I can take a demand forecast, for example. I can look at, like, say, solar forecast or the solar energy, how much solar energy would be created at any given point of time. I could think about, oh, what the price is going to be looking like when I go trade it in the market, and then I'm going to apply this in a piece-like manner. But today, with this sort of AI, I can actually simulate the entire scenario. And AI can help me simulate the entire process, including those points where AI could have, where we used to do forecasting and so forth. So there are several differences as a result. It just enables a completely different body of use cases that are possible. And then the third interesting thing, I think, which is a very important characteristic, is that what was first centralized as AI, like, oh, it's running in some place in a cloud, in some server, is now getting more pervasive. It's also on the edge. It's also on all devices. It's on machines. So it's edge plus cloud, right? And so it's more federated. It's more democratic. It's not like all reasoning is happening in one central place. It's actually all over. And what now is basically is a systemic evolution of AI where intelligence is really talking to each other in very powerful ways.
It's interesting. I don't know if anyone feels like this, but when you say that, I imagine that for leaders, the idea of it being everywhere and decentralized is incredibly stressful when you're thinking about how to best deploy this, what I need to do, how do I need to prepare. So talk to me a little bit about how leaders want to think about approaching something that has to be sort of built in from the design point and is everywhere and is reasoning, especially when it comes to the energy transition. For the energy leaders in this room, what are you doing at Nagarro? Connect that back to the energy transition.
No, absolutely. So if I can belabor a point again, right? I really want to separate this hype of AI versus the actuality, the truth of what AI is really capable of, really, right? And that's one of the key challenges I feel leaders face today is the skepticism that they feel when they think about somebody talking about reasoning with models and like, can it really reason? Can it really come up with insight? So really working hard at that level and seeing like, and this is true of not just the energy, but practically all domains, that you got to see your own business process. And you got to look at like, I have these suboptimal workflows lying in my, various situations in my enterprise. It might be in HR, it might be in finance, it might be in R&D, it might be wherever, right? Really giving a hard look at that suboptimality. And then thinking with awareness, with knowledge of what is available when it comes to what AI 2.0 is, asking and pushing your teams to really apply themselves to a problem like this, right? And in the case of energy, right? I mean, the role I am in, I'm often in situations where I have to persuade, or I'm talking to, leaders who are running organizations and trying to show them the possibilities of use cases. A question that keeps coming up is that ROI. What's the ROI for me to be able to do this, right? And half the time we are really talking about, don't worry about the ROI yet. Frame the question slightly differently. Think about what would be the consequence of not doing this, because the differential is too much in a few months and in a few years, right? And then there are many other arguments. So one of the important things that we kind of think about when we are thinking about how energy how you all are, that there are people in the room and how you should be thinking about it, is like really applying looking at your own use cases, looking at your own suboptimalities, and then wearing the fresh sense of understanding of what AI 2.0 is and thinking hard. And it's not easy because it's not there already. There is no script. It's not like somebody can search it and say, here is a use case, but really looking at it and then asking your engineers and your architects to think about whether it can be solved or not, right? And that exploration path is important. The second important thing is to invest in partnerships in topics like this, really. And the partnership is very crucial because we learn off each other, really, more than anything else, right? And in the energy domain, even so. And hyperscalers are doing an excellent job bringing a lot of these frameworks into their platforms. It's already built in many, many different ways, right? So investing in those platforms is very, very key. I'll talk about a specific interesting use case we did a couple of years ago, and that was all about energy trading for one of the larger majors in US. And the idea was that this particular organization is interested in generating energy, but it has it has choices of whether it wants to sell it directly or it wants to store it in the batteries that they have, and so forth, right? And so we were like, okay, 2 years ago, this thinking was extremely linear. Like, okay, let's build a few forecasting models. Let's really look at optimization and then come up with a price point that would be the most optimal at some level, right? Today, for example, this entire workflow can be achieved with agentic architectures. And agents are like these mythical AI algorithms or programs that know how to really sense. They run in iterative loops. They can plan, and they can act on something like this, right? So the same use case can have some very outsized outcomes on something like this, right? So exploring these possibilities as much as possible is really, really key.
Does that not give you something measurable in terms of ROI? I'm sure some CFOs may have sort of, keeled over when you just said, don't worry about the ROI. But this is a difficulty when you're trying to, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it is the, phrase we hear all the time when we're thinking about this. How do you overcome that? And can't you, from these use cases, figure out what the ROI is? Because it's one of the things that's holding people back, I think, from making these investments.
It clearly is, and unfortunately, I don't have a very straightforward answer to give there, right? I feel like a lot of companies which are succeeding with AI have just put their will behind AI, and they're investing really, really heavily, both in terms of resources, in terms of platforms, in terms of just the willingness for people to try some of these technologies. The actual fruits and benefits will come later. So for example, in coding, there are some colleagues of mine, and they're working on these topics as well, right? We have been working on trying to use AI to really improve how we write code. And a lot of things around, when we're doing that is like, how has that improved our efficiency of writing code? And you can do these A/B tests, right? Like I can have a group of people do this thing without these tools, and another group of people do it with these tools, and then do the statistical t-test and come up with like, oh, I think it's like a 10%, 15% improvement. But it would not substitute any ROI conversation in any form, right? I mean, if that's somehow evidence of, hey, this actually works or not. But look at what a company like Anthropic is doing. Anthropic, I think most of us are familiar, and I take that example, but it's true of OpenAI, it's true of Google, it's true of all these big companies, is that their teams are already using these tools to write these new AI, and the iterations and the speed at which they are turning out products is just mind-boggling. And that's what everybody can see, and what the real consequences look like.
So I guess a great question, if that's the case, is what kind of mindset? We heard Rochelle mention, someone put on the board, the need for adaptive leadership. What sort of mindset should organizations have as they approach this and deploy it effectively, not just keep up? I think some people are just trying to keep up, but what kind of mindset should an organization and leadership have?
Yeah, absolutely. Really important. And we live in this world where a lot of people will lead and some will follow, and so it's a distribution there. And I think we all have our situation, and we do the best in the situation that we can, really, right? But the mindset question is really important. I mean, there are a few things there that I can maybe talk about. One of them is this KPI-based approach or an ROI-based approach. Maybe it needs to be rethought. Like, what could be the new KPIs in this new world that we are living in? And for example, one of those KPIs could be explainability, like the narrative that I'm kind of sharing, like the world's become complex. How do you really navigate this world? You need new tools. Now, this is adaptive behavior. I can't give you a number to really replace that. But if that's a KPI that you can think, that would be pretty powerful. If you think equitable thing, like I have like 10 engineers, 100 engineers, however you see it, and they are different levels of productivity, but what if I bought a democratic tool or a democratizing tool which really enables them to improve where they are, right? Suddenly it's about equity. Same things with resilience, for example. So I'd say one of the shifts in mindset is to get out of that traditional KPI. This is a different world. We are not going to be,
That's a really, really interesting concept, really interesting. This is an issue that comes up all the time. We have a question coming in. How do you address concerns about data security using AI? I think this is another hurdle that's been a real struggle and a concern, and rightfully so.
Yeah, no, reasonably. And that's a question we get a lot, and an important one really to address. So with AI, for example, there are possibilities for us now to really keep the data very separated from the models. You could control where the data lives and how the model really consumes that. There are several layers at which you can put these safeguards or guardrails. First of all, you should really sign these and look at these model usages and the legal verbiage that goes with it, and there is enough protection for you that's already been provided by LLM. So really, if you get into that, right, that's one important layer. The second is how powerful is your AI going to be has a lot to do with marrying the model with your specific data. It's not the model in isolation. It's like it really gets its power by when it sees the data that your organization has and then can adapt to that answer, really. So finding ways for us, and there are enough technology, engineering approaches to really marry that well. And the most important thing is what we call an AI governance first approach, which is saying, oh, listen, I'm going to design this architecture, I'm going to do this top-down thing, and here is where the 10 things I'm going to do to ensure that this works. It's hard work, but I think AI governance first approach can also ensure a lot of that at some level.
Amazing. Let's just end on this and briefly, but it sounds like we talk about all the areas where AI can really be harnessed, and you mentioned this in helping make sense of a volatile world. What's your thought on the energy sector? You're doing a lot of work there at Nagarro. Is this an area that can really benefit from what AI and AI 2.0 is bringing to the table?
Absolutely. I think energy is just one of the loveliest places to really apply AI, in my opinion. It's so fundamental. Energy is an abstraction for a person like me. I remember my school days, and energy is just work, for example, is how they described it. But here is an industry, right? It's actually dealing, making, producing, selling, trading, this abstraction. It's no longer an abstraction, really. And it's one of the more complex things. There is this mix of modalities when it comes to energy. There is solar, there is coal, there is fuel, gas, and all of that, right? There is the grid issue, which is like a fairly complex issue, balancing stuff and so on. Trading around energy is like, I think, 2 times the trading that goes, that happens with option trading, for example. It's even more complex because there are physical laws to what you can trade or not. I mean, I can't make a bid for something where I'm going to do a 500 megawatt on a line, which is congested. It would be a wrong trade, for example. So the physics becomes important. So there are just so many concerns. So building AI around some of these things is just very, very appropriate. We are doing a lot of things around figuring out how to really bring a lot of these decision loops with grid balancing, with automatic bidding on energy, and so forth. So, but I'm happy to talk more later.
Fantastic. Anurag, thank you so much. Great way to start off the day. Thank you.